So thank you very much, everybody. And this is the fourth lecture in the CEMO lecture series on process data in educational assessments. And today's lecture, I think for me is particularly exciting because it relates to the digital transition. And as I was saying in the earlier lectures in this series, my belief is that process data is inherently something new. I know it's been around for many years, but it's new in the sense that we're dealing with a quite profound transformation in assessment as many assessments move to a digital mode. So we've got this digital transition that's taking place at the moment, and that brings with it a number of different possibilities about how we use process data. And I would say also some obligations for how we use process data. So I'm going to talk about some of those things today and some of the issues that it raises. So just to recap then, I had identified in previous lectures 4 legitimate uses of process data. And we've been skipping about on those different uses this week. But today's one, I think I really would like to focus on the use of process data to improve test and item design. Okay, so we're using process data to inform item design and to check on user experience, mode effects, and so on. So I've got a couple of images to start off with, which I wanted to share with you. And this one is from my research in Slovenia on the OECD's PIAC assessment. And this image is obviously taken from a photograph or sketched after a photograph because of anonymity. And there's a bit of audio transcript that comes with it. And there's a particular moment towards the beginning of assessment where the test taker, in this case on the left, was a little unsure about how to use the keyboard. And then the test administrator says, "Here," and she lifts her hand up, and the test taker looks at the hand and actually nods in a very slight way to indicate, yes, go ahead. And then she presses a key on the laptop and it changes the laptop so that he can use it for Slovenian language. And then he says, "I see." And then she says, "Now this keyboard will work as well." And he says, "Oh, great." So what's going on in that? It seems to me we've got some quite interesting interaction in that particular image around the use of computer-based tests. And in this case, we're dealing with something quite specific towards the user experience, which relates to the material artifacts. In other words, to do with the actual computer and the keyboard. So nothing to do with test item design. But as we can see, those material aspects of a computer can actually impact on test performance. And in this case, the interaction with the test administrator has resolved the problem. So we have an interesting case here in PIAC, but also a number of other assessments where we have a human-computer interaction, and also we have human-human interaction. So in a way, we have human-computer-human interaction. And there's many assessments where there is a test administrator present or interviewer, where that interviewer actually takes on a role to help people to manage their use of the online assessment, whether it's the actual tablet or computer or some aspect of the interface to help them to navigate the system. So it introduces things about experience, people's familiarity with hardware and software, and interaction that takes place. Another image here, this one is from my research with the OECD's PISA for Development. There is Strand C assessment with out-of-school youth. And this was from pilot observations that I conducted in Senegal. And I used video and eye tracking and observation to observe how people were interacting with the tablet-based assessment in Senegal. So I just want to tease out a couple of points there from these images. First of all, the sketch here is from a photograph. Obviously, it's been anonymized. And what you have here is a very nicely illustrated sketch, which shows the interaction between the test taker and the test administrator. And I love these crossing of hands and arms. So you have the test administrator who has one hand on the tablet, and the test taker who has another hand on the tablet, and their other hands cross, and they're both attentive to the task. And so we've got a number of things going on here about the use of the tablet. In fact, the screen and the keyboard in the PIAC assessment, sorry, not PIAC, the PISA for Development assessment, could be separated. So in theory, it was possible for them to separate the keyboard from the screen, and the screen works as a touch screen, which should then be handed over to the test taker. So there's some issues about administration, but I would argue that the administrator is helping the test taker to use the equipment, and that his presence is actually not detrimental, but actually it's supportive. What complicates the PISA for Development assessment in many countries, including Senegal, is it's a multilingual context. And in this context, with PISA for Development, people can actually choose between languages for the assessment. That's certainly one of the things that computer-based testing can provide, is the option for people to choose the language of assessment, and in some cases to switch between languages during the assessment. Well, in this case, the child has chosen, or the young person has chosen, to take the test in French, which is not his main spoken language. And so what you see here in the transcript from this encounter is a bit of multimodality and code switching, as the test administrator and test taker switch between French and Wolof. So I'm not going to read it through there, but you can see there's continuous switching between the languages as they talk about how to manage the test item. So you've got really quite complex interactions there between language, including language on the platform, and the use of the hardware and software, etc. So what about the literature then? What's it saying? Well, there's a nice quote here from Hubley to say, while there's plenty of research that's examined relationships between online design features and subsequent response behaviors, there's only speculation about the processes that underlie these behaviors. And then there's another quote there from Russell and Hubley, which talks about the interactive dynamics of the online environment and the technical aspects of devices used, and how it relates to the respondents' personal experiences and expectations. So we've actually got a number of kind of overlapping, conflicting sets of issues there about user experience, prior experience, people's skills and expectations about how they use the hardware and software. And as Hubley's saying there from 2017, we only know a certain amount about the underlying, what shapes those underlying behaviors. I mean, I would argue that since 2017, there's quite a lot that's been learned, but nevertheless, we're still relatively new in that field. If we were to look at another area such as online gaming, we see an enormous amount of experience in terms of user experience. And I think we can learn a lot from other fields such as online gaming and user experience research more generally, about how people engage with online tests. And as test designers and users, we have to accept sometimes we're not the experts. And in the case of online design, we're certainly not the experts, because there's many people who work in other aspects of gaming and user experience where they have a lot more extensive experience. Of course, there are differences between online assessment and other forms of gaming, etc. But nevertheless, I think we can draw a lot on that wider experience to help us with design. Okay, so let's talk a little bit then about mode effects. As we talked about on previous lectures, my view is that modes are not the same, clearly. So when we talk about equivalence, we have to think about that in terms of how we compare data across modes. Not to try to assume that the data is the same across modes, but to try to understand what it means to move across modes. Okay, so most of the research that's being done now and the results that are coming out is suggesting that there are indeed mode effects as people move from paper to computers. But as I've also argued in the previous lectures, we almost have to give up on the paper-based test mode if we're really going to make the most of computer-based testing and its affordances and its potentials, which means trying to think about these mode effects not as equivalence as in being the same, but equivalence as in how do we make comparisons across the modes. So there's a number of people who've done research on the OECD's PISA assessment as it transitioned to computer-based testing that have pointed out that there are indeed differences in the mode and how it impacts on test scores. Just to go a little bit further, there's a very nice 2020 paper by Zenner, Krone, I'm sorry about pronunciation, Hanel and Goldhammer, where they look at what people write in text-based responses in online assessments. I think this was perhaps PIAC. And they say, even though students were attempting to answer an item more often in this particular computer-based assessment, they were less often successful than on paper. They're talking about a particular item. And I think it's important to drill down to the item level. And they go on to say, it's likely that the attempt rate was influenced by the fact that the computer-based implementation reminded students of empty text fields. I love this quote because what it's suggesting there at the end, the computer-based implementation reminded students of empty text field is an interactive, dynamic context where the computer is reminding the student of something. Okay, so the computer is doing something which previously the test administrator might have to do, to say, you've got an empty text field here. So we're now beginning to deal with the role of the computer as an interactive, animated agent. You might call it a non-human actor who's influencing the response process. So in those earlier descriptions that I showed you, we have a test taker, an administrator, and a computer. But as computer-based testing develops, quite a lot of the agency of the administrator is being integrated into the test. And so we've got the test as a dynamic, interactive, animated interface that people are dealing with. And that changes things to some extent. Okay, so just to tease out some of the themes that we might look at, we're dealing with dynamic content, as I've shared. It's interactive, it's multimodal. With computer-based testing, we're dealing with adaptive designs, which we were never dealing with really in any significant way in paper-based tests. It enables us to improve accessibility. So for example, people who have disabilities or specific learning difficulties, there's various ways in which you can improve the accessibility of online tests. And there's additional software that people might be able to use to integrate into the test to improve accessibility for people with disability. As I've suggested, it can help with multilingualism and multilingual assessment. People can switch between languages as they do a test. And then we're also drawing on experience of gamification, which raises all sorts of interesting and challenging questions about how that impacts on the construct. So when you gamify an item, whether it's a serious game or a fun game, what might you be bringing into the construct which changes it? For example, around motivation, self-regulation, gaming experience, etc. Okay, the second point there is materiality. We are dealing with computers with a distinctive materiality. we're dealing with computers or tablets, issues around screen quality impact on, there's a literature there that shows that screen quality impacts on people's performance. So real material factors. People have to learn how to manipulate and use the mouse and the keyboard. And certainly in my research in Slovenia, I noticed that the fatigue in people's mouse hand impacted on their performance, and the performance of mice also impact on the performance. And then there are aesthetic issues. How pleasing is the item? How enjoyable and how pleasing? And we get into user experience and design issues around people's prior experience in using the online platforms, issues around test preparedness and test wiseness. Are they familiar with the platform? Do they know what to anticipate and how to use it? There's issues around semiotics, the signage that we have in assessments. So in the top left corner of the screen, you can see a red arrow. What does it mean? In some contexts, this might mean go to the next item. It might mean exit from the test. The color of the arrow might make a difference, whether it's red or green or some other color. There's also the question mark icon. What does that mean? Now, in some contexts, educationally, it might mean if you have a question, click this icon. But in a lot of gaming, it might mean I want an additional question. And so what we've observed, for example, with our research on gamified user experience, is that those semiotics, those icons really matter. How do those icons relate to prior experience? How do people understand them? And how do they relate to other established semiotics in other game-based activities? So, for example, how do they compare to the other games that children play, whether it's Minecraft or Forza or whatever? If you have an icon where the meaning is different from a game, it can cause real problems. Okay, and this last point then is that we can use process data for item design and testing in user experience studies and beta testing. We don't normally beta test extensively a paper-based item. Of course, we might share it with some people, with some subject experts or a small group of children, perhaps. But with computer-based testing, there's a real obligation to share beta versions of complex interactive items to check that people are engaging with it in the ways that we expected. Now, obviously, there are issues there around we don't want to reveal test item content, but certainly in terms of design, for example, for examinations, we can be sharing the designs with other content. We can be sharing the interfaces at a beta version in order to get feedback, to actively obtain feedback on how people are engaging with the test in order to understand the user experience and to help us to understand the process data that we might capture. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to a short animation.
We'll arrange it this way. We'll place it here so you're more comfortable.
It's okay. That's it. So we are here and go down here. I see, good. Let's move on. Will you do the talking?
No, I'm not allowed to do anything.
Yes.
You work independently. Yes, that's it.
What now? I've already done this. Choose a month and I chose October. Now what? Why again?
Choose May.
I see, I did,
The instructions are always at the top.
I read only select a month and I chose the month we're in. I blew it.
The instructions are always at the top.
I have to take a look.
Nothing works with enter?
Yes, I understand.
Okay.
So the animation shows a number of interesting things. First, all about the materiality of the testing event, the testing situation, because in this case, you've got the test administrator who's positioning the computer and the mouse so that the test taker can take the assessment. And as you can see from the transcript, she says, we'll arrange it this way, we'll place it here so you're more comfortable, etc. And then there's a question about, will you do the talking? And the interviewer says, no, I'm not allowed to do anything. And I love this quote. What is the administrator doing there if she's not allowed to do anything? I think she is allowed to do something because she's able to help manage the testing situation, the administration, and the smooth performance of the test. Because although the person's using a computer and there's a carefully designed interface, the agency is spread there between the test taker, the administrator, and the computer. But the computer cannot provide the information about the positioning of the mouse, setting up of the keyboard, etc. So yes, the administrator is not supposed to do the talking, but in fact, in this case, she is talking. So there's a three-way interaction that's going on between the computer, the test taker, and the administrator. And she's emphasizing there that you work independently. You should work independently. There we are. Will you do the talking? And now we come to an example from the animation where the test taker makes a mistake, the respondent. What now? I've done this already. Choose a month, and I chose October. What now? What? Why, in fact, again? And then, so she's calling on the interviewer again to help. Choose May. And then the response is, I see, I did. And then the interviewer says, the instructions are always at the top. The respondent then says, I haven't read this at all. I read only select a month and I chose the month we're in. I blew it. So we've got a really interesting response there. So we've got an effective response combined with gesture and talk. I blew it. So the person's clearly, emotionally, somewhat rattled at that stage. And we've got some item navigation issues. Okay, so there's item navigation that may not be the fault of the test taker, but may in fact be a design issue. It's not 100% clear what the source of that error was, whether it was to do with the prior experience of the test taker or the interface design. But whatever happened, you've got a situation where the person makes a procedural error in the navigation of the item and feels upset at having done that and slightly embarrassed, I think. Then you get a section of what linguists would call repair, where the interviewer repeats, the instructions are always at the top. And she leans over to see the screen and she points to show the test taker. And the test taker, the respondent, says, yes, I have to take a look. And then again, the interviewer affirms, nothing works with enter. It always goes, and she points to where it goes on the screen. And then the respondent says, yes, I understand. So what we've got here is not just providing information, but some kind of repair, some emotional and procedural repair to help to settle the nerves of the test taker in the testing situation. So we move from the person saying, I blew it, to a repair situation where there's some smiling going on and a calming of nerves and so on. So you've got a distributed agency in these contexts between the test taker, the computer, and the respondent, which is a very interesting dynamic. So to conclude then, first of all, when we deal with response processes in computer-based testing, it moves beyond equivalence. We're looking at the comparability, but we're not looking at the same thing. There's distinctive characteristics of computer-based tests, which are quite different from computer-based tests. And increasingly with dynamic next-generation assessments, they're going to get more and more different as we make the most of process data and we make the most of computer-based designs. So we're dealing with what I would describe as a decoupled mode. Decoupled in the sense that it's no longer simply a reflection of the paper-based test, but it has features and characteristics which are distinctive and unrelated to the paper-based mode, affordances, potentials that are available to us in computer-based design, including the use of process data. When we look at that, are we dealing with digital constructs? How might the involvement of the computer or tablet or digital mode impact on the construct that we're trying to assess? Is it perhaps seeping in? Is the digital mode seeping into the construct in the ways that we need to better understand and research. Second point there, very often computer and paper modes combine. I mentioned this in a previous lecture. So it's not just that one mode replaces the other, but sometimes we have multiple modes which add to each other. So in this case, people might use pen and paper, but you've got verbal interaction, you've got gesture, you've got facial expression that's all taking place in the testing situation. So there is what we could call externalized cognition, in the sense that our cognitive processes go beyond our mind to the material environment that we're working in, whether that's pen and paper or use of keyboard or use of mouse, etc. So if people use the mouse cursor in order to help them to read, to highlight text, or to highlight a piece of the image that they're looking at, the stimulus that they're looking at, it's a form of externalized cognition, using the mouse as a tool. There's also potentially missing log data, for example, where people use, where they stop to talk with the administrator or where they use pen and paper, that multimodal process data can capture in ways that log data alone can't. The third point there is that we're looking at the computer as an interactive agent. More and more, we find that dynamic next generation designs are actually writing agency into the item and into the interface. So in a sense, we're transferring some of the agency of the test administrator into the platform and into the item. So people are less dependent on the administrator and more dependent on what comes on the screen. In which case, for example, in adaptive designs, AI-based systems, avatar interaction, in which case, user experience really has a central role. We need to understand user experience. We need to understand item navigation. It's integral to the digital mode. It's not peripheral. It's absolutely core to how people navigate and interact with computer-based test items. And it shapes test performance and our understanding of validity.